Hello, it's great to be here, and today my title is The Problem with Cats in Boxes. And the question that starts off is, what's in the box? And in this case, it's a cat, but in general, though, what I want to talk about is stories and storytelling, and how it shapes and influences our life without you realizing it. And hopefully you can see stories in a different way. Now, I was someone who grew up with books. My earliest memories are me spending all day in the library and my family reading me stories and sharing stories with me. And I love stories and I love books. And the older I get, though, the more I realize that it's not the books that I love having, it's the stories themselves, and how the stories that I love and the stories that are my favorite become a part of me. And they form my identity, and they inform me in my life. And to a certain degree, the stories become, in a weird way, my own memories. And in talking about this and studying literature and being a fan of literature, one of the great things about literature is the promise that things are going to work out. And that's what makes literature so much fun. But that depends on one critical thing. We have to connect. We have to get along. We have to find common ground, whether in terms of respecting each other, loving each other, or what, but we have to connect. And all the great stories has that message. But with that said, one of the things that I really enjoy studying and participating in is the use of metafiction. Now, metafiction is a device that's used to show a story in a different way. But mostly it's fiction about fiction. A common example of it could be a book about a writer writing a book, so that you are reading a book that is inside a book, or watching a movie about people making a movie. Now, with metafiction, the whole point is to manipulate fiction, to manipulate the story so that it exposes a truth of the story. Now, some examples of this that I want to share with you are what I call the metafictional encounters. And that is when the writer of the story enters the story itself and interacts with his own characters. And a great example of this is the 1973 book, Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. It's a fantastic American novel, but what makes it so great is that halfway through the book, the narrator, who's Kurt Vonnegut, declares to you that I am going to enter this story, and I'm going to interact with my character. And what happens next is a creator meeting the creation. And it's a beautiful meeting. And by the end of a story, what you have is something that's very heartbreaking and very beautiful. Another example, more recently, is Stephen King. In his Dark Tower story, he enters the book, and in this case, the characters in the story enter our world to save the life of Stephen King. And Stephen King, in June of 1999, almost died from a car accident. And in this story, the characters enter the world and actually save him from that event. And the last example I want to look at is Grant Morrison. Comic book was published by DC Comics at the end of the 80s and ended in 1990. 26 issues, and in this story, at the end of it, Grant Morrison has Animal Man enter our world and meet Grant Morrison himself, the writer who's been creating all of these problems in his life. And so, Grant Morrison I picked for a specific reason, because he introduced me to the idea of what's called a fiction suit. A fiction suit is something that a writer puts on to enter a story, to manipulate a story, to manipulate the fictional space of a story. But what makes the fiction suit so interesting is it's not so much the writer entering the story and changing things. In doing so, he is changing and influencing reality itself. And that's what makes the fiction suit worth looking at. And because of that, this fiction suit creates a space that is neither fiction or reality. It's a mixture of both. And these tools of metafiction and fiction suit, the reason I'm bringing this up is this is not for writers, and this is not only for people who love reading and enjoying stories. It's for everybody. You're wearing a fiction suit in many times of your life. You're participating in the same thing these writers do all the time. And to understand that, I'm going to jump back in time in 1935. And we're going to look at the physicist Erwin Schrödinger. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand everything that this guy talks about and what he does, but I do want to look at the storytelling aspect of his thought experiment of the Schrödinger's cat. And what you do is, you take the cutest cat you can find, and you put that cat inside a box. And then in that box, you have the cat, a radioactive isotope, a Geiger counter, a hammer, and a bottle of cyanide. And so what happens is, you put it all in the box, and that isotope has a 50-50 chance of emitting radiation. If it does, the Geiger counter will go off, it will drop a hammer on the ground, and break the bottle of cyanide and kill the cat. But the box is sealed. We can't open it. We can't look inside, so we don't know if the cat is dead or alive. And because we can't open it, the cat exists in two realities at the same time, two states. The cat is dead and the cat is alive. And until we open that box, it will exist in two different states. And we call this state the superposition of states, the collision of this, the cat being dead and alive. Now, I want you to remember this term as we move forward to 1978. And this is where I'm going to jump in the story. In 1978, I was 4 years old, living in New York with my family. My older brother and I, we had this pet rabbit, all right? And we loved this rabbit. But the problem is that my parents had to take care of the rabbit for us because kids can't take care of rabbits. And my dad hated the rabbit because he had to clean it, feed it, clean the cage. And so one day, my father takes my brother and I and says, I'm going to go outside with the rabbit in the cage and clean the cage. You stay in the house. And so my dad goes outside with the rabbit cage. My brother and I, we run to the giant window in the kitchen, and we look outside to watch. And what we see is my dad taking the cage outside, putting the cage down, opening it, taking the rabbit out, putting the rabbit on the ground. And what we see is my dad talking to the rabbit, pointing, very seriously. And then he turns around and he walks into the garage out of sight. The rabbit, being any rabbit, sees an opportunity, looks around, and just runs. And my brother and I are at that window watching our favorite rabbit run out into the distance, into the woods, and we never saw it again. And we freaked out. We ran outside and we're crying, and we're just freaking out crying, and we go up to my dad, I'm like, Dad, our rabbit is gone, it's gone. And my father, with the most serious expression on his face, goes, oh my God, I don't know why. I told him to stay. Now, this is one of those stories that has been told again and again in our house. It's part of the mythology that creates a family, through stories. And we like to tell the story a lot because we like to make our father feel guilty about what he did. And so, in 2004, I was visiting my parents and at the house, and my brother was there. And during dinner, my brother starts telling the rabbit story again. And, he's telling it and I'm listening, but there's a huge difference in my brother's version of the story and my version. In my brother's version, I'm not there. He says I wasn't there. My mom had taken me shopping, and my brother was alone, and that my father had told my brother to stay in the house, and he went outside. And here I am, I love metafiction. A writer can enter a story. And here's my brother just taking me out of it. And he took me out of his story. And it really made me think about the story, about what was true and what isn't. Is my brother's version of a story true? Is my story true? And it made me really consider this. So, that said, jumping ahead to 2007, I'm again visiting my parents, and I'm going through my family albums. And I see pictures of the house that we grew up in New York. And I'm looking at pictures of the kitchen, and I noticed something very, very important. The giant window that my brother and I are looking out of did not exist. In fact, there was no way that my brother and I could physically look out the back of the house and see my father doing this. Which meant that probably both of our stories is not true. But I remember it. I remember the coolness of the window. I remember the blue sky, the grass, and I remember crying and just freaking out. I remember the emotion of that day. But apparently, it didn't happen. The problem is with memories is that every time you think of a memory, that perfect day that you always reflect on, every time you consider it, you're overwriting the image. You're changing it. Every time. And you're bringing motions from today and pushing them into memories of the past. You're constantly changing the memories. And our past, our life, is stories. Because the only way to hold on to stories is the memories, is to turn it into a story. Because then what happens is you're not remembering the memory itself, you're remembering the story. And the story doesn't change. You tell the story again and again and again. And because of that, and because our life, our past, is made up of our memories and our stories, our life is fiction. It's fiction itself. Memory is fiction. And we are trapped in this state between fiction and reality. Because there's no objective reality, and there's none the opposite. So, with that in mind, I would call this the superposition of fiction, pushing it, that my memories are both fiction and real. All right? Just like that cat is both dead and alive. And with that, that means is that our life is that cat in the box. And we cannot open that box. We never will open that box. We can't unless we can figure out time travel and going back in time. Even if you have pictures of an event or a video, people will disagree about what happened. People have different interpretations of events. We are in that box. And more importantly, we are wandering through life today, wearing our fiction suits, constantly creating new stories, constantly altering, changing details. And not only that, not only am I wearing the fiction suit, but I'm surrounded by other people wearing their fiction suit, and we're crashing into each other, changing our stories, affecting, influencing one another. And so, it brings me to today and brings me to now. The reason why I'm here is just that we are surrounded by noise, and we're living in a time where there's a lot of different ways of communicating. But I don't feel that we're doing it right. More and more people are feeling more and more alone, and which is amazing. We can communicate in ways that we could not have imagined 20 years ago. I can contact with the device in my pocket right now anyone in the world if I wanted to. So with that, with all these ways of communicating and talking to each other, whether it be SMSs, whether it be emails, whether it be tweeting or Twitter, or whether it be Facebook status updates, all these things, we're not telling stories anymore. We're shouting at each other, back and forth, yelling out. We're not telling the stories that are important. We're not using the space like we should. We post pictures without any information. We say on a Facebook status, I had the most amazing day. And you hope that somebody says, what happened? And even then, you can't guarantee that you're going to tell the story. You need to share your stories with each other. It is vitally the most important thing. More importantly, you have to understand that you're wearing your fiction suit. And you're going to meet up with other people wearing their fiction suits. And what I'm going to ask of you and what I'm going to challenge you, make the challenge for you is to share your stories with people. All right, you're on that first date with somebody or you're meeting a person for the first time, you're not reading off a list of things I hate, things I love. You're telling stories about who you are because those stories are who you are, your identity. And that's the thing, the information that the other person is going to take to wonder, is this the person I'm going to love? Is this the person that I want to be friends with? Your story will shape you, create your identity. And so I want you to share those stories with people, communicate those stories. And more importantly, I want you to meet with people who were part of the same memory as you and share your interpretation and hear their version and see what happened and see if you can find common ground. All right? And when you share your stories, when you express your ideas, when you express who your identity is, you create the possibility of connecting. all right? And that is the promise of storytelling, the promise of literature itself, that if you connect, everything is going to work out. Everything is going to be okay. And that's the message I want to give you today. Thank you very, very much.